This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. Have you ever read a book that changed the way you think about the world? For me, it was Testament of Youth, a memoir written by Vera Brittain. Vera gave up her college studies to enlist as a British nurse during World War I, and reading about her experiences completely changed my perspective of that era. Books can be a powerful teaching tool. They can inspire change, hope, and even activism. Back in the 1800s, Uncle Tom's Cabin was one of those books. Connecticut-born abolitionist Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote the novel to expose white people to the horrors of slavery. President Abraham Lincoln even called her the little woman who wrote the book that started this great war, referring to, of course, the Civil War. Uncle Tom's Cabin inspired generations of writers and activists, but its legacy is more complicated today. This hour, we'll learn more about that, plus the long tradition of literary activism in Connecticut and beyond. Erika Slocumb is the new director of interpretation and visitor experience at the Stowe Center for Literary Activism in Hartford, and she joins us today. Erika, thank you so much for being on Where We Live.
Thank you for having me.
And just a quick note to listeners that the Stowe Center for Literary Activism is a Connecticut public sponsor. And if you have questions, please give us a call, 888-720-9677, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. So, Erika, before we jump to what's happening at the museum, tell us about your background. And because in addition to being a part of the museum, you're also an artist and an advocate for social justice.
I am. So I am a PhD student at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst. I love researching Black history. I shamelessly love Black people and everything about our history and culture. And so I think just being able, particularly to research early American, Black experience has been one of my, I guess, great loves. Mm-hmm. If that's not,
Do you remember if there was a moment that inspires you, or was it gradual?
I think so. I really enjoyed sitting with my grandmother and her friends and just listening to them talk about stories of, so my grandmother migrated to Massachusetts from Greenville, South Carolina in the 50s. And so I think just listening to, her and her uncles and, aunts talking about the experience of being in Greenville. But I think in 2004, I was a freshman in college, and my uncle bought me a plane ticket to Spartanburg, South Carolina. And he was like, let me just walk you around. And he would call, and he was like 75 at the time. And we would sit on the phone for hours, and he would just tell me about what it was like growing up. He was in the military, so his experience in the military. And I think going to Spartanburg and Greenville and meeting family and listening to folks' stories, I think really, so 17, 18 at the time, really sparked this interest in listening to people's stories and kind of documenting what their experiences were throughout their life.
So this makes complete sense.
It does. Absolutely does.
Well, and then we mentioned earlier that we talk about Uncle Tom's Cabin, which I think many Connecticut residents I've either read or maybe know about. But for those who are not familiar, why did it become such an influential work?
I think in part because one of the things that Harriet said herself is that she wanted to paint with words, right? And so she wanted her readers to be able to visualize and feel what the experiences of people that she spoke to and stories that she read, that really inspired her to write the book, right? And so I think that it had a sentimentality to it that resonated in a way that was human to human, as opposed to othering, right? That folks were used to. And also I think that she appealed to, white Christian women, right? This is our duty to take up the cause of the enslaved Black folks in this country.
Well, and it caused a huge stir at the time in different ways. I think people really latched onto it. And I think it resonated with a lot of readers and people at the time. And how does it fit with the wider landscape of literary activism?
I think that the way we like to think about it at the Stowe Center is that the original, literary activists were Black folks who were writing about their experience in slavery, right? This period of enslavement was tumultuous, right? And you have this, and I mean, that's a light word, right? To say tumultuous, right? Because it's, traumatizing for generations, right? Whole, bloodlines are lost, are inflicted with this. I want to call it like a mental illness, right? Because to enslave a person is just a wild thing. But I think that, again, like the way we think about literary activism is that folks are writing their stories down. They're relaying their stories, those folks who couldn't read and write at the time. They're relaying their stories to family members or to white abolitionists, right, in order to let their experience be known, right, in a time where folks aren't really listening, right? And so I think that there's this conflict, right? Because one, I just want to correct you because Abraham Lincoln didn't actually say that she was the little lady. I think that is attributed to her son's biography of her life.
Okay.
Now, I think it is attributed, but it's the key to Uncle Tom's Cabin, which Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote in 1853, in response to really Southern whites saying, "Who's this Yankee woman who knows nothing about about slavery, about enslavement, who's writing about slavery?" Right. So you have Aunt Phyllis's Cabin and other anti-Tom novels, right, that come out that it's like, actually, enslaved people think it's great, like this whole system that's crushing them, physically, mentally, and emotionally is okay. It's not that bad, right? And so she writes the 1853 Key to Uncle Tom's Cabin, which is basically her annotated bib, right? That's like, here's where I got this information about. Now I'm like drawing blanks on names of characters, but for the Tom, for instance, she drew from Henry Bibb and Josiah Henson's, narratives, and others, right? Franklin, Frederick Douglass, Harriet Jacobs, and folks she spoke to, like John Andrew Jackson, right? And so I think that it's important to note that although this quote has been, passed down for years upon years, that it's the key to Uncle Tom's Cabin that Abraham Lincoln takes out of the Library of Congress, which is firsthand accounts really of excerpts of narratives that folks wrote.
Well, and corrected, of course. And also, building on what you were just saying, it's sort of the perfect transition into talking about present day, because Stowe did listen to these stories and she painted with their words, really, right? And created such a very powerful narrative at the time. And as we get more information exposure, as we get more space to be able to look back and look at history today and see it with a different point of view and perspective, how have we changed the way we think about how complex this text actually is?
I think that, so one of the books that I really appreciate is the annotated Uncle Tom's Cabin by Henry Louis Gates, right? Because I think that there's this moment of being able to look at the book, but also to kind of like, flesh out what this narrative, what this novel means, right? I think very often we've looked at Uncle Tom's Cabin as this, prolific, story that has, pushed abolitionism and anti-slavery forward. But also I think it's important to realize how much harm in many ways that the book did for, stereotypes of Blackness, right? And so you see that in, Frederick Douglass and Martin Delany, kind of their responses, and much later, James Baldwin, when he calls into question in his essay, Everybody's Protest Novel, right? That it has done great things for opening the eyes of white moderates, right, of the 19th century, and in many ways, again, did harm for Black advancement based on the stereotypes of Blackness, right? The infantilization and kind of like we have to take care of Black folks, right? And also just being clear that while Harriet Beecher Stowe's book, it's the best-selling novel of the 19th century, right? Only second to the Bible, which is wild, right? Sold worldwide. Also had understanding that while many people have observed Harriet Beecher Stowe as an abolitionist when in fact she was anti-slavery, right? And so the difference in those two things is anti-slavery really looks at and says, this is bad and it should end, but it doesn't necessarily recognize that enslaved people or formerly enslaved people, Black folks in this country had autonomy, right? They had agency, that they didn't need to be taken care of, right? So I think just looking at it from that lens, what we've been really doing at the Stowe Center is looking at what Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote down in her Key to Uncle Tom's Cabin, of how important it is not only to read Uncle Tom's Cabin, but also to read, freedom narratives, as we call them, also known as slave narratives, to understand from a Black perspective what the experience of Blackness in this country was, both under slavery and, after.
Well, and clearly such a long learning process that's ongoing over the years. And with that in mind, as you're learning and teaching and creating, how did you go about thinking about the space to showcase authors that came before and after Stowe's time at the center? Because I think when you joined, you want to explore the way that we think about literary activism.
Yeah, so I think when so we have the Gallery for Hope and Freedom, right, which was previously the Gallery for the Global Impact of Uncle Tom's Cabin. And in that space, when I first came to the Stowe Center, actually, when I came to the Stowe Center as a visitor, not as the new director, going into that space, I kind of felt like, for lack of a better term, ick, right? Because there were all of these thaumaturgs. And for folks who don't know what thaumaturgs are, they're, porcelain figurines that portray scenes from Uncle Tom's Cabin, right? And so a lot of them were racialized in a way that, for me, felt like, really Samba-wise. So if you think the big watermelon smile and the big red lips and the charcoal skin. And so for me, those are racist iconographies, right? And so walking into that space with a case full of just that and not having a lot of explanation of what these things mean, right? And not to say that the work wasn't done, because it was, right? There were explanations and things, but that visceral reaction of I've come through the house, I've listened to the tour. I think there was an evolution of the interpretation from a teacup tour to really talking about Stowe and her, kind of progression into writing and her journey into writing Uncle Tom's Cabin. And then one guest said, it feels like a gift shop, right? It doesn't feel like this is harmful history, but it felt really harmful to them, right? And so thinking about the way the interpretation is currently evolving, right? Where we're talking more about and looking at what Stowe wrote in The Key to Uncle Tom's Cabin in her explanation of characters and what is happening when she's in, Connecticut, what happens when she moves to Ohio and Cincinnati, and really thinking about who are those people that consciously and subconsciously are, like, she's taking in their experience by walking down the street, right? She's taking in their experience, by seeing a human auction in Kentucky, right? She's taken in the experience of an abolitionist newspaper being, destroyed, but, before her eyes, right? And thinking about when we get to that room full of tomatos, like what does that say, right? Yes, thinking about, the fact that, best sold novel, 19th century, right? Like it has an impact, but really what we were looking at was the impact on white material culture, right? Not the impact that the novel had on Black folks, right? Not looking back at what freedom narratives meant for the future of, Black literature and Black literary activism. And so now what we have is a space where when you walk into the room, you do see, the impact of Uncle Tom's Cabin, but we're starting with the key. We're starting with those narratives. And we're kind of, not having seen the space, it's to me, it's really beautiful. But again, that's like a shameless pat myself on the back. But, we did a lot of work to think about who do we want in the space, both, past and present authors, both past and present artists, right? And so the gallery really has become a space where we are talking about hope and freedom, starting with the hope and the quest for freedom of, enslaved and formerly enslaved people, and into, generations of Black authors and artists, again, who are taking and learning from directly that history of, our ancestors, that history of, other folks in this country, and saying, here's who helped, here's what was detrimental, and here's how we've, persevered. Here's this resilience. And thinking about that space in partnership with other, community repositories. So, thinking about 224 Ecospace and wanting to partner with them and contemporary artists. We currently have Amanda Mendez, who is our Artist of Color Accelerator, right? And thinking about, we currently are putting up today, actually, art from a woman named Carol Washington, who is also a Connecticut resident, who does this, brilliant like painting and tapestry. And so just thinking about that space of like potential and possibility, as folks are coming in and as folks are leaving, from the past to the present.
Well, and just really quickly here, the fact that a guest would describe seeing the earlier exhibit as like going into a gift shop, I think that's really powerful in many ways. And with that in mind, you went in and started this curation, and now we can walk through sort of history from past to present as you've been describing. Just real quickly here, why do you think it's important to sort of give this idea that this particular work has inspired so much since then, and for us to see that it's actually still continuing, right?
I think it's important because I think often we think about history in a straight line, and like it's not linear, right? It's cyclical. And so I think for students especially, as a mother, I think about my sons, coming to a space that is so integral to their history, right? Being in this country, that for students to walk into that space and make connections to what is happening still now today, but also to be able to see and understand the past right, in a way that isn't always taught in school. And thinking about, too, how folks learn and learning isn't linear, right? And learning, everybody, students don't all learn the same. So to have this like literature written and this literature and the art that's speaking to them in a different kind of way, I think, I think it's important for folks to see it all out, laid out, and to be able to have a space where they can talk about it.
Well, we're really glad this space is available. You've been listening to Erika Slocumb, who's the Director of Interpretation and Visitor Experience at the Stowe Center for Literary Activism in Hartford, and she's with us today for the hour. Coming up next, we continue our conversation on literary activism and hear from Possible Futures Bookstore in New Haven. And listeners, we want to hear from you and let us know what you're reading right now. Join the conversation, 888-720-9677, or leave us a comment on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. Today, we're talking about literary activism of the past and present. The Stowe Center in Hartford defines literary activism as crafted narratives with purposeful calls to action. Books like Uncle Tom's Cabin, which inspired generations of writers and activists. To talk more about literary activism of today, we are joined now by Gregory Perot, who's the Associate Professor at the English Department at the University of Connecticut. Thank you so much, Greg, for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
And also with us is Lauren Anderson, who's the founder and bookseller at Possible Futures Independent Bookstore in New Haven. Lauren, welcome back to Where We Live.
Thanks so much for having me.
So, Lauren, you've been listening to Erika's conversation here. Anything that jumped out to you that you would like to respond to?
So much. So first of all, thanks to Erika for the amazing work that you're doing at the center. I think we're all really so grateful for it. I was just struck, by hearing Erika say that, the original literary activists are really Black folks writing about their lives during slavery and just the crucial importance of, from a Black perspective, right? The experience of being Black in America. And I would say like a lot of what comes to mind when I think about literary activism now is ensuring that there is space for those voices that have been crowded out by white supremacist forces to be able to tell their own stories, right? You could imagine like from a refugee perspective, the experience of being a resettled refugee in America, or from a queer perspective, the experience of being queer in America. So somebody like Toni Morrison, right, has written a lot about the white gaze, for example, and how so much of what has been produced in American literature has really been about the projections of white people, telling stories that aren't their own to tell, and that those have by and large been the most kind of proliferated. And I think in the sort of sense of whether we think about it like Howard Zinn, you can't be neutral on a moving train, or somebody like Martin Luther King Jr. and the idea of like creative maladjustment, we know that our institutions, our schools, for example, or the publishing industry are shot through with all of the isms that are at the heart of like our country. And so if we're not actively working to widen the range of voices, then we are complicit with the privileging of white stream perspectives. And I think, the kind of, when I think of literary activism in the present, I think it could be lots of things, but I think at the core of it is sort of all of the efforts from different places in the system by different people who are positioned differently to ensure that the voices that need to be heard are heard. And in some cases, sort of a real and true effort to correct a history of exclusion by overrepresenting, which is a kind of reparations. And it's not just a kind of reparations that we do for repair, but it's also a kind of reparations that we do to ensure that all of us have the knowledge that we need to navigate the world that we're in. And we've been terribly shortchanged, all of us, and terribly miseducated by systems that continue to privilege some voices at the expense of others and continue to allow people who are not cultural insiders to a group to tell us what that group's perspective is, what their stories are, what their contributions have been.
Well, and Greg, especially with what Erika and shared earlier and what Lauren just shared, what comes to mind for you when you think of literary activism within the African American and Black literature?
Well, Erika alluded to a conversation around Uncle Tom's Cabin, specifically between Frederick Douglass and Martin Delany, two of the most important African American abolitionists of the time. What I find interesting, and that I think relates to this moment and others, is how still relevant the terms of that conversation are. In essence, I'm summarizing widely here, but Delany had major issues with the portrayal of enslaved people in the novel, but also with the fact that Stowe would be the one writing it. He mentioned Bibb and the other sources that Erika mentioned earlier, essentially saying, well, she and that was before the key, of course, but he said, she just took other people's stories and made them hers. Douglass had a very pragmatic approach to this. Essentially, he was saying, well, where were you, right? And I mean, are you writing anything? Saying this book is not perfect, but it did open a place for us to step in. And I really think he was not admirative so much as pragmatic and saying, well, we can use this and we can use the flaws of this novel to say things in places we couldn't say things before.
Erika?
And yeah, I think just this mix of pragmatism of and idealism and the questions about how to put some ideas through, how to impress people with certain ideas, are still around today. And so I think this book is a really interesting example of what is still going on to this day.
Well, and Erika, I love your response here because it kind of echoes to what we were talking about earlier, how this book made a splash. But what do we do after the splash?
Right. And I think so. To Gregory's point is not to your point, but I'm happy that you brought up again Frederick Douglass and Martin Delany. We actually have Dr. Tracy Hucks for our Who's Harriet series. She's going to be coming and actually talking about the debates between Frederick Douglass and Martin Delany. I don't have the dates because that would be too much for my brain. But if you visit stowecenter.org /calendar, you'll have the dates of when that talk is actually coming up. And I think it's coming up in the spring, so fairly soon. But I think that, when we think about Frederick Douglass, right, and in his pragmatism, and using this opportunity, of the splash, right, like of the floodgates kind of opening up, and the possibility and the potential of folks listening, like white folks in particular in this country who were moderate, listening and actually having a perspective of, oh, like that's happening and it's bad and we should do something. It's Douglass who is rallying for, Black men to be entered into the Civil War, right? Like he's rallying, his constituents to, and co-conspirators to write to Lincoln to say, like, this war needs to be about slavery, right? It's Black folks who are writing to, not only doing, right, like, but also writing to say, like, this is our experience, even as free Black people. This is our experience, with the fugitive slave law. You see with folks like Solomon Northup, right, who's born free, is, sold into slavery because of this act, that it has real implications for Black life in a way that, while Harriet can empathize, right, or sympathize, like it has no real consequences for her white life, right? Other than making her a lot of money. And I think that we like to problematize that at the Stowe Center, right? Like this idea that she did write this thing, it was very popular, and also Black folks had been doing it, right? Which made it possible for her to even come up with the story. Like the story, as Greg said, didn't just come from her mind.
Right.
You know what I mean? It was like real experiences that she really like kind of watered down to appeal to folks. And from that, you know, Delaney writes Blake in the Huts, you know, that, you know, his narrative about, you know, Black enslavement and the experience from a Black perspective. But I think, I don't know, I think obviously at the Stowe Center, we are grateful that she wrote the thing. Otherwise, we wouldn't exist. And
Right.
also, I think the fact that she wrote the key enables us to open up, you know, as
Greg.
no,
Lauren.
Sorry, I was like,
No, we all get
as-
that. We all get that brain cell.
Yeah, I got one this morning and no caffeine, a little bit of caffeine. But you know, as Lauren said, you know, it opens up the possibility for like the stories that weren't being recognized to be recognized, right? It opens up the opportunity and the possibility for us at the Stowe Center to say what other stories aren't being told, right? Like who are the other people who, like my job at the Stowe Center is to work myself out of a job, right? Is that I plan to take our history, and by our, I mean Black folks' history, as far as I can take it at the Stowe Center. And for others, right, you know, Indigenous folks, you know, Latinx folks, to come in and say, here's our story as well, right? Here's our perspective as well in this time. And so I think that this is getting like big picture and you know, in my mind's eye, it gets crazy. It gets really wild. But I think that, you know, in the tradition, I guess, of Stowe, but really of other Black artists and activists, is like really thinking about how is our struggle bound up together, right? How is our struggle the opportunity for me to say, here's how I'm hurting, here's how I was hurt, here's my story. How does that help other folks and give opportunity for other folks to say, well, we're here too, and we're also struggling. We're also, you know, when you're looking at immigration today and comparing it to, in some ways, to, you know, family separation and reunification in the 19th and 20th century, you know, you see those, you know, correlations. And so like we can open that door and have a conversation about that as well.
Right. And because you took us really in real time to time right now, I want to go to Greg real quick here too, in terms of, I think we have seen literary and political activism with writers being on the forefront over history, as Erika has just built for us. And Greg, you're currently writing a book on Black Power era fiction. Can you tell us or tell our listeners about that and some of the works that are featured in that era of literature?
Yeah, and on the way there, I've been meaning to quote, you know, one of the most famous quotes by W.E.B. Du Bois, but I think is really relevant here when he says, "Art is propaganda and ever must be." I mean, the term propaganda has sort of gotten negative, but I think it really means politics. And I think, you know, one of the central ideas of the literary activism is to be, you know, again, not just pragmatic, but also to realize that not everyone has the luxury to make art for art's sake, right? That art has influence, as we've been talking about since the beginning of the show, whether you want it or not. And so awareness of that power makes for, hopefully, for a different practice of art, no matter what art, but especially writing, right? Like the idea that you can actually convince people. Just as another quick caveat, Douglas wrote The Heroic Slave in the aftermath of Uncle Tom's Cabin. The point being, of course, to present an entirely different figure of enslaved people. And one element that I always appreciated, that's fairly didactic, but in the novel, one of the main characters is this white man who is convinced, you know, rhetorically by the heroic slave to become an abolitionist. and his name is Listwell, as he listens well, which I always thought was really interesting, because it also implies that that the readership and the people who might feel passive about those things actually have a very important role to play in the literature that they're reading. But to go back quickly to what you were saying, so I'm focusing on the fiction of the Black Power era, which tends to be, I want to say, sort of a sad parent in Black arts of the time, because poetry is very important to the movement. Music, of course, is central, and everybody relates to it, and I would say cinema as well. But in a way, fiction tends to sort of fall by the wayside. So that's one element I've been very interested in. And books that may have been popular at the time, but that sort of somewhat forgotten. I'm thinking of John A. Williams' Sons of Darkness, Sons of Light, other novels of revolution. That's really what I'm looking at. The novels that imagine a Black revolution in the United States. So yeah, I mean that's the corpus, and I'm sort of studying not just what they say, but in what context they said it, and also importantly, because I'm writing this for a French press, how they sort of interact with what France was seeing of the Black Power movement.
Well, and with that awareness too, before we go to break, Lauren, I want to talk about the intentionality behind your book space and about the works that you sell at Possible Futures. And today, as we reflect on the legacy of Harriet Beecher Stowe and the works that she inspired, but also recognizing that the negative stereotypes that was found in Uncle Tom's Cabin was perpetuated for a time. So, how do you make decisions about the works and authors that you feature and the ones that you don't?
I should say, we call ourselves a book space as, like, instead of a bookstore, is a cross between an independent bookstore where obviously we sell books and a community reading room, because we do think it's really crucial that people have public spaces where they can encounter books and also encounter the kind of books that we intentionally shelve. So we always say that we shelve almost entirely books by authors from groups that have been historically underrepresented in publishing and on public shelves. And that's really, again, like going back to what I was saying earlier about being a corrective sort of on the history of, mainstream production of literary stuff in and for the United States. And also just the decision-making around what has gotten a lot of attention. And even when you walk into your average bookstore, what books face out, like what books are featured prominently. As far as making choices, I mean, that's always hard because we're small. We cannot have everything. I think we very much look to our community. We work a lot with educators locally. We work a lot with community groups. And so some of the decisions that we're making are really about having a collection that is curated in response to the needs of just our local neighborhood and the people who come to us. Some of whom are, for example, let's say they're doing work on housing justice. There are certain kinds of books and authors and narratives that are really important for them to encounter on the shelves. I also think because we're on a street with a school, and we envision ourselves to be a safe space for young people and folks, young people of all ages, but especially young people who are kind of school going. We think a lot about, like, what does the space need to have in it so that when a young person from our city walks through the doors, they know that they are loved and affirmed in that space. They know that they belong there. And in New Haven, that means understanding who our neighbors are and thinking really concretely about the visual culture of the space and the collection, so that, when our neighbors who are resettled refugees from Pakistan come through the door, there are positive, beautiful representations of them and of where they come from. There are also helpful resources for them in navigating their journey to being a part of our community when they've been new to it. And so I think that's sort of some of what goes into the thinking about it. But we also are always taking suggestions, and we're really grateful for the beloved community that we're a part of that, calls us in when they're like, look, you really need to have this on the shelf and it's not here. Or helps us make hard decisions about what to include in and what to make available, but maybe not to always have on the shelf.
Well, it sounds like on theme here, it's a community effort to create that safe space. So appreciate you sharing that with us. You've been listening to Lauren Anderson and Gregory Perot, who will stay with us after the break. And Erika Slocumb from the Stowe Center for Literary Activism is also still with us. And just another quick note for listeners that the Stowe Center for Literary Activism is a Connecticut public sponsor. And listeners, how are you choosing what you read right now? Let us know what your thought process is, 888-720-9677, or let us know on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shin. When's the last time you thought, that book changed my life? And what book were you talking about? Today, we're exploring literary activism of the present and the past. With us still are Gregory Perot, who's the associate professor at the English department at the University of Connecticut, Lauren Anderson, who's the founder and bookseller at Possible Futures bookstore in New Haven, and also with us is Erika Slocumb, who's the director of interpretation and visitor experience at the Stowe Center for Literary Activism in Hartford. And just another note that the Stowe Center is a Connecticut public sponsor. So I want to jump back straight to the conversation. Lauren, because you're in a book space, you see a lot of young people of all ages. How do we inspire the next generation of literary activists, both readers and writers?
I feel like that's such a good question and such an important one. I think one of the things is to figure out what they're already reading and to work from there, because a lot of the time, especially with like reluctant readers, it's just their ways of engaging with the literary world, with the written word, have not been the things that like their schools have celebrated. So, for example, a lot of kids now really love graphic novels, and there's a huge and expanding array of options for them to turn to, both fiction and nonfiction. And I think it's really talking to kids about what they're interested in and what questions they have about the world, what's on their hearts and minds, and helping them find books to engage with that speak to those issues and that make them feel seen and heard. So that's one part of it. And then I also think just opportunities for young people to produce and to engage with things that have been produced by people like them. And I think of zine production in particular when I think of this, because zines have such a long history of importance in political movements, even if we think about like pamphlets going way further back, right? The creation of things by people who care about an issue, and then the dissemination of those things to a broader constituency. And I think right now, zine culture is a real thing. They're like often very porous communities. Like there's a lot of willingness to bring new people in, and they allow young folks to create things about the issues that they care about, to use images and words and all kinds of things, poetry and music, even bringing in music, and to see themselves as creators of cultural content, which I think oftentimes our young folks don't realize that those books on the shelf are made by real people who sometimes sleep through the alarm and,
right. Just as human as they are.
Yeah, are imperfect and, have a range of different capabilities, a range of different struggles, and a range of different strengths. And I think when they can start to really see themselves as contributing to the world of literature and to the world of like the written world and to political action through reading and writing and speaking and listening, I think that it goes a long way to helping them become people who turn to books and turn to written resources for comfort, for self-education, and for the cultivation of imagination, which of course we all know is so crucial now, certainly as much as it ever has been.
Well, and Greg, I want to get some recommendations for you for our listeners that want to dive into Black Power era fiction, but I also know graphic novels are sort of your area as well.
Yes, I've taught, I regularly teach a course on graphic novels at UConn, Stanford. What Lauren described is really my intellectual upbringing. I grew up on graphic novels. I grew up reading them. I grew up making fanzines. And it's funny, just earlier, I was thinking, I think, there's really a community of spirit between what Du Bois is talking about, what Douglas is saying to Delaney, and, punk rock. And it's the DIY spirit. If you don't see it, you make it yourself. And it's a profoundly political stance, I think, and they may not feel that way, but it is already there. There's something intrinsically political about saying, well, if I don't see myself, then I'm going to put myself out there. It's often a matter of survival at some level, and I think it feeds everything we've been talking about. It's never perfect. I think it comes hopefully with an awareness that perfection is not the goal, but that doing is really what matters, and putting things out there. And so, and importantly, and related to this conversation, it's also that all things we may have felt that we were taught about how to rank cultural production and what is good or what is secondary, what is subculture, doesn't matter, I think, so much as what reaches you. And I think graphic novels of finally getting scholarly recognition, but I find that a little laughable. I mean, I'm part of it, I guess, but I had never any doubt about the value of graphic novels. It's great that my colleagues now realize, all over the place. But then, one thing that was always obvious to me is that this is a format that speaks to people. And maybe you may think it's easy as it's a negative thing. It's a positive thing.
Right.
If you can reach people in any way that you can reach them, I think it's positive. So I appreciate that you get to study it, but I think it's also a form that's proven that it needs no one, except the people making them.
Well, we're all smiling because I think we're all graphic novel fans here, and unfortunately, we only got about a minute and a half. So I'm going to do a quick lightning round of everyone's book recommendations, and because Erika and I are making eye contact, Erika, go.
So I would suggest reading Josiah Henson's life narrative, Harriet Jacobs, and The Key to Uncle Tom's Cabin. But if you're talking to young readers about slavery, enslavement, and Reconstruction and civil rights, I would say the 1619 Project has Born on the Water, and we actually use that for our Inheriting Freedom to kick it off, to talk to K through 12 students, K through 6 students, about slavery.
And Lauren, a book that you would recommend?
The Parables by Octavia Butler. There could not be a more timely read than those, both around like what's going on in the world and also the importance of kind of coming together with chosen family. Autobiography of Malcolm X. It's its 100th year since Malcolm X's birth, 65th year of the book being out. Super tremendous read.
And Greg, really, really quick, one book that you would recommend?
So I'll just say this one that's coming soon is Eve Ewing's Original Sins, The Miseducation of Black and Native Children and the Construction of American Racism. I'm looking forward to it.
Beautifully done, everyone. And we will have a list of this available on ctpublic.org/wherewelive for our listeners, so you can all check it out. I want to thank our guests today. You are listening to Erika Slocumb, who's the Director of Interpretation and Visitor Experience at the Stowe Center in Hartford, and Gregory Perreault, who's an Associate Professor of English at UConn, and Lauren Anderson, who's the founder of Possible Futures Bookstore in New Haven. Thank you all for joining us today.
Thank you.
I'm Catherine Shen. Today's show is produced by Tess Terrible. Our technical producer is Dylan Reyes. Download Where We Live anytime on your favorite podcast app. Thank you all so much for listening, and happy reading, everyone.